So as a coaching client, I get this like bird's eye view of my character, motives, and competencies, right?
Especially males tend to rank themselves as being very competent usually. So they always say like, I'm really good at conflict, I'm really good at leadership. If we want to coach, we also have to understand the person as holistically as possible.
What are you building on there in terms of psychological grounding?
I'll make it as a coach, light the spark inside, empower every soul to turn the tide. I'll make it as a coach, help others grow, changing lives with every story I know.
Personality assessments are all over the internet. It's easy to find out which Harry Potter character you're most similar to in case you can't guess and in case you care. Personality assessments are also all over the coaching industry. Many coaches I've interviewed on the making of a coach throughout the last year use MBTI or DISC. And I also experienced the huge impact that an MBTI assessment had on my personal development during my first Train the Trainer event more than 10 years ago. It made me aware of behaviors and preferences, differences to other people, and it gave me a language to talk about all of this in a group coaching context. There's many fans, but there is also lots of controversy. Can personality really be described in 4 colors or in 16 types? My guests on today's and also on next episodes have a clear answer to that. They say that only the Big 5 model can describe personality in an evidence-based way. So they took the Big 5 as a foundation and built the LINC Profiler, one of the most successful profiler tools in Europe and also growing worldwide these days. For this episode, I took the LINC Profiler myself, and today I sit down with Lars Voigt from LINC to describe my profile, learn about its psychological grounding, and also do some cross-comparison to my DISC profile from a few episodes ago. Let's see how all of that holds up.
Yeah, the LINC Personality Profiler is a compact scientific personality inventory that gives coaches and, of course, HR professionals the option to have reliable, valid personality information to develop and coach people in a scientific manner.
Cool. And how does your daily life look like at LINC these days?
It's a lot about talking to people. I've been working there almost 3 years now, developing our tools, selling our tools. We have to still develop based on feedback. And that's exactly what I'm basically doing. I'm in contact with our certified coaches, trying to stay on top of their needs, their feedback, taking that into our development department so we can adjust the tool, improve the tool, and enable constant development of good psychometrics at LINC. So it's a lot of emails, it's a lot of calls, it's a lot of back and forth between all kinds of different people. And yeah, that's my day-to-day, basically.
Mm-hmm. And let's say I am one of these certified coaches now working with the LINC profile. When would you say would I bring it into the coaching journey? When would I use it?
Well, we always recommend to bring it into the coaching journey right at the start of it as a diagnostic tool, just as the initial starting point, really, to have a blank canvas to give the coachee the opportunity to reflect upon him or herself and to give the coach the information that he or she will need in order to then go in depth with the coach. So putting psychometrics at the beginning of a coaching process will always make sense.
So as a coaching client, I get this like bird's eye view of my character, motives, and competencies, right? You're using the term personality now. How do you measure personality?
Yeah, personality is, of course, something that psychology is trying to measure all the time because it's such an important aspect of what makes us unique as people. So at LINC, at the heart of it, it's the Big 5 model, the Big 5 factor model, which is a model from personality psychology that was developed in the 90s. And roots back all the way to the 1930s, when psychology still was a very young discipline. As a result, we can now reference back our personality inventory to a long-standing tradition in psychometrics, in psychology as a science. If we want to coach, we also have to understand the person as holistically as possible. So the personality information that we give you at LINC includes Big Five, as well as motive structure, as well as competencies. So the basic idea was that the Big Five are useful in order to give a general image of what a person is like. The motive structure will give you the ability to then talk about what drives this person, right? Because just to know one's personality isn't usually enough to understand why we behave in certain ways in certain situations. And that's exactly what we then also add in terms of the competencies, how they will probably perform, and what kind of behavior they associate with certain terms, like, for example, leadership.
Yeah, awesome. So you sort of summarize personality as these three components, which are character, motives, and competencies. And with LINC, you measure all of them. And the character part is actually based on the Big Five model.
That's correct.
And what do you use for motives and for competencies? Is that also like well-known model from psychology, or have you developed that yourself?
So at the heart of it, we have developed it ourselves. Motives as a psychological construct are hard to measure, right? So we look at the motive literature, and there's one model that is from the 1970s made by David McClelland, who derived three basic models that are prevalent in workers in a work relationship. And the first one is the so-called relationship motive. He also identified the performance motive, as we have mentioned, and of course the power motive, right? To have influence on others. And we took this model and derived our own items from that to, of course, measure it as economically as possible, and extrapolated based on our items that we have derived from this model that we are able to measure 9 distinctive motives, which are the 3 motives that I just have mentioned, like rooting back to McClelland. We could add, for example, that we can differentiate the relationship motive also into subparts like norms and values and lifestyle, for example. We distinguished performance into creativity as well, and growth, and influence as well. We derived it into influence, into security, and independence as motive structures.
Yeah, I was going to ask now, we talk about motives, and then you said, okay, you make a distinction. What's the difference between motives and values?
There's, of course, a strong association because our values inform motives and the other way around as well. If you have a strong or very distinctively expressed relationship motive, then probably something like friendship might be a value, a norm, something you really strive for.
So I could say, okay, friendship is a value of mine, but then what I hear is motives take that to a more practical application. Like you decided, okay, we have a tool for leadership development. We want to focus on the work aspect. And that's why you decided to work with motives compared to a more holistic values inventory.
Exactly. Yes, that's true.
Okay, then let's move on to competencies. What are you building on there in terms of psychological grounding?
Well, we have a strong work focus, as you probably have guessed. So competencies, again, we think like are behaviors that we can observe in the workplace. That's why we have competencies like leadership, like creativity, like conflict management, and being able to then root back and get an understanding of how am I performing right now in my work context regarding this competency. Am I good at that competency? Am I handling situations that involve this competency well? Of course, that's interesting to know. Yet again, people always tend to, especially males, tend to rank themselves as being very competent usually. They always say like, I'm really good at conflict, I'm really good at leadership. This is fine. From our perspective, this is always fine because the individual has always a right to say, I'm in such and such a way. It's the coach who has to really then see, is this person truly honest to himself, mostly, because they don't have to prove themselves to you as the coach. They have to be able to prove themselves to themselves. So you pretty much recognize pretty quickly, are they honest to themselves, or is this something that they might not be aware of, that there is a blind spot maybe, something they should develop. And we try to give you information that would enable you to identify that. Of course, we never say that this is the whole truth. Like we have a second indicator we're going to go into later. We have a person indicator, which is exactly what I've described to you, that the person then ranks themselves in a certain competency and says, I'm the best leader ever. And then we have our needle or location indicator, which is derived directly from the Big Five model and correlates that are in empirical or based in empirical evidence from the Big Five model that indicate certain characteristics that this person has are in such and such an expression for this person to really be able to have this competency in a certain.
Yeah, interesting. And I also did the profile. You invited me to take the assessment. I've done that, and maybe I'll quickly show us on screen here how that looked like from my perspective. You sent me a link and I basically hopped into your tool, did the test. My task here was to actually pick 3 of these items. So I have like 5 statements in front of me and I now pick 3 of these in a certain order. So the one that I find most appealing, I click first, the other one second, the third one third. This part 1 is where you measure character, so the actual Big Five model. Is that right?
Exactly. We have 3 parts in the test. The first part is the Big Five model, exactly, with our Big Five items. Then part 2 is motive structure, so motive items. And part 3 is the direct assessment of your own competencies.
Yeah, that's the part 2 that you mentioned. So here I pick
2 out of 3
here.
Exactly.
Yeah. So similar to the first challenge, simply only 3 options. This is where we look at motives, right?
Exactly. That's the motive structure.
Yeah. And then lastly, part 3 looked somewhat like that. So I always get the question, how strong is this competency for you? And then I get like a 1 or 2 word competency. I have some sort of activity here, and then I score myself on a scale of 1 to 5.
Exactly.
Okay, great. Then let's maybe hop into the outcome. What did I get with that? What we can see here is now the 3 sections that we discussed, right? We have the character traits, so the Big Five model, we have the motives, and we have competencies. Let's maybe go through them bit by bit. How would you do that now if this was an actual debriefing of me having taken the assessment? And we're now in this coaching process pretty early, so we possibly haven't even dug into my issue that I came to the coaching session with. Maybe I didn't even come, but I was sort of sent by my employer. How would you go about that?
So in this early stage of a debrief talk, especially looking at this overview page, it's about engagement, right? We want to activate you as the coachee, as the employee who is maybe not terribly interested in talking about him or herself at this point. So the overview page is something that is usually designed to engage the person as much as possible. So we can see trends in the Big Five here, which are underlined in yellow. So for example, in your case, extroversion would be something that is of interest to you, and openness would be something that is of interest to you, just because you have ranked yourself, you have rated yourself as being, as a character, very extroverted, very much open, right? So I would just generally go into a very brief question like, do you have an idea what extroversion would be about? And then you answer that, of course, and of course always introducing some ideas in this process of what you are actually about, because in the end we just don't want to stick with the results. We want to get to know the person. We want to understand what extroversion you bring to the table and how this relates to what you're actually doing. So, of course, ask about, do you understand this? Is there something you relate to? And we then move on to the motive structure. Again, very much a general thing where we are like, look, we have value motive here, we have the independence motive here, and we have the creativity motive here. And this is something that will probably speak to you in some way. Is this something you think you can reference in what actually drives you, what actually motivates you? And the people then usually say, yes, of course. For example, value motive, yeah, I usually have a very strong idea of what I want to achieve in life. For example, I'm in a company that is developing medicine, like a pharma company, for example. I really strive for good life. And they can reference that at this early stage in certain ways. And the competencies, again, we never have a total truth here. We don't know this person is really good at networking, is really good at intercultural competency. But it's something that we can talk about to say, look at this result. You are saying that networking, intercultural competency, initiative, reflectiveness, holistic thinking, this is something you are really good at, right? Would you say that the order in which this report puts these competencies is actually reflecting your personal skill set? You should reorder it in a manner. Maybe reflectiveness is higher expressed than the results indicate. What do you think? right? And at this stage, we're then, of course, engaging.
Yeah, thanks for the overview. And let's maybe do that in a small demo.
Let's do that. So you probably have some idea what extroversion is about. Do you?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's more than 10 years by now that I did my first 2-day personality types workshop. Introversion, extroversion is kind of the aspect that most personality models share. And yeah, I think also back then I scored high on extroversion. And now we say personality is stable, but I still believe over time and also aided by discovering, this is actually a spectrum. I would say I actually became more introverted. I was sort of surprised that extroversion came out highest here. And at the same time, what I also see, if I look at these scales, and there I'd be curious for your feedback, having seen many profiles, it's also not that this is very extreme. You underlined extroversion and openness as my strongest preferences here. At the same time, all of them are just at 5 out of 7, and there's actually a bunch that score around that level, right?
Yes, they are, of course. So the idea in why we are underlined, for example, now openness and extroversion, is that, of course, there is a score behind this scale, right? But we don't show the score. That has a reason on its own, which we can go into later. But in the end, of course, we know, like, based on your answers, based on your items, extroversion is something that is definitely highest in your character, as well as openness.
Okay, so here we can basically see the ends of the spectrum in which order they score for me. And we have openness, extroversion, cooperation, conscientiousness, and sensitivity.
Exactly. So now we know, like, your openness is your main character trait, and then followed close second by your extroversion.
Mm-hmm. And at the same time, we see here that, okay, it's like a +5 on the extroversion with a 3 on the introversion. So it's not super extreme, but still, that's the order.
Exactly. Yes, because it's always about the tendency, right? We never say you're the extroverted type or you're the open type, because this is not something the Big Five model would usually entail. So we always try to open the perspective of, yes, you might be a very open character, but you have steadiness in your character, which should be understood as well. Don't put yourself in that drawer. Don't say I'm the open type. But if, of course, we are going to develop you, we should be aware of what kind of aspects are there to your personality that make you very open, right? And what kind of behavior is associated with that? Because anything that we're doing should be something that relates back to our character, should be something that is related back to our strengths. And of course, everything that we are doing that is natural to us, which, we have to behave as we are, is easy to us. And a person to then understand what kind of tendency they have in their behavior makes it able to then look at the environment and say, okay, like, there are certain environments that force you maybe to be very steady in certain aspects, right? But that's not something you are comfortable with, maybe, because your character is, of course, opposite.
So what I hear is that it's really important for you to have this spectrum. And that's maybe also where you draw the line between LINC or the Big Five model and for example, 16 personalities or MBTI, which sort of reduce the spectrum to one end of the spectrum, right? So you say, okay, I'm extroverted, versus on the spectrum of extroversion, I have the preference that I'm slightly more extroverted than introverted. It's just a bit of a mouthful compared to saying, okay, extroverted, tag, here, you go into this box.
Exactly.
Let's go back. Where would we continue?
So I would say, let's go back to the motives and let's talk about that. I see you have a very strong value motive. Do you have an idea maybe what kind of value you're striving towards in your life?
I would say in general, I'm quite purpose-driven when it comes to my work. And that's also quite multifaceted if you ask for specific values. I think it's about impact and about tackling the big issues. And that led me to choosing the energy sector as a place to work in, to then realize a few years in that, well, actually, our energy transition is not held back by technology or by business aspects, but by people's resistance to change At the same time, I had a lot of psychology related stuff going on that really drove me into, okay, maybe I want to better have an impact in this mental health space. That's how I then kind of shifted my career from energy sector to learning and development, let's say.
See, there is definitely a lot of purpose driven, a lot of value in what you're doing. You see value in what you're doing and you try to strive towards that.
Yeah, and let's move to competencies.
Yeah, you have a very interesting profile of competencies you bring to the table. There are definitely a lot of people-orientated competencies, like, for example, networking, intercultural competencies, but there's also a lot of academic competencies that are present, like, for example, holistic thinking and, of course, initiative. So how would you say, are these competencies, as they are put in the order by the test, like networking first, intellectual competency second, would you say that that represents your abilities, or would you re-rank those?
Yeah, I don't have a particular preference. I think overall this looks quite accurate. Maybe I would score the initiative, proactiveness a bit higher. That's sort of my blessing and curse at the same time, because there's always lots of things I could do and then also drive myself to pursuing them, leading to mental overload to some degree. There's always maybe one or two projects too many on my plate. So if you ask me where can I see overuse maybe of these competencies also, then I would say, that's definitely in the proactivity, the initiative aspect one, and possibly also the networking. I mean, I really enjoy connecting with people, talking to our customers, talking to people on this podcast, which oftentimes I would say, educates us for developing our coaching tools. And at the same time, of course, there can also be you can either think or you can do, right? And when it comes to networking, I would say that's broadly in the thinking, in the learning category. And that hinders me then from actually getting shit done. And getting from learning about what would be possible to actually working on making that real. So I would say the networking and the initiative ones are the ones that really stick out to me here, where I'd say I score high, and that's not always great.
And you have proven right now to be very reflective, which, again, you haven't mentioned so far, but you have throughout your explanations right now, right? This is all you're reflecting, and you are doing that as natural, basically. So I would say this should be something you should maybe rank higher.
Yeah, thanks for that feedback. Yeah, so what we can see here is sort of the deep dive into the character, right? So here we can really see, okay, how did we get to that introversion, extroversion score? And what are the items that you look at that provide the average for these scores?
Exactly. So relating back to the Big Five model is, of course, we have big five factors. We see that here in extroversion, flexibility, steadiness, or introversion, conscientiousness, openness. But each factor has its own facets, which again are like 6 subcategories attached to each character factor. Relating back to the facets themselves, having information on these very detailed aspects of one's personality really can drive a coaching process, really can drive a developmental process, because we can revert back to very specific behavior, and we can allow you as the coach to reference back to a very detailed picture of the person. So I now know, even though we have seen you are more of an extroverted character, you might associate that with a social openness. Do you have an idea of what your social openness looks like?
So one thing that definitely stuck with me from reading the report is this tendency to trust, like rather being open also when it comes to the business world, let's say, talking to people there. I don't value secrecy a lot. And I learned that maybe from one of my first entrepreneurial mentors, Jochen Schwill at Next Kraftwerke, who was, when it came to talking to customers and competitors, very open, like, okay, it's not the intellectual property on that level that we are discussing here, that anybody could benefit from, quote unquote, stealing from us. And that I found quite interesting, because I think it helped him a lot to establish trusting relationships. And that really inspired me to also then do it similar to him. And that's where I can really put this social openness in combination with maybe this conceptual innovation that we see in openness to work.
Yes.
Interesting. So if I look at these categories of the Big Five, introversion, extroversion, then conscientiousness versus flexibility, openness versus steadiness, cooperation versus competition, and sensitivity versus emotional stability. If I would have to make a guess, I say that there's a correlation, for example, between openness and cooperation, and possibly also extraversion. Like if I score high on one of these, then I'm also more likely to score higher on the others. At the same time, I believe, okay, Big Five is really the established model and they have nailed it down to these 5 categories. So probably they are independent of each other, right? How is that?
Yes. So based on the mathematical model, they are independent from each other. We have experienced things from our personal point of view. We might have seen certain people that have certain correlates, right? That they're extroverted and open. And over time, we might have learned that certain character traits go hand in hand. But that, of course, is not something that is proven by science, by the Big Five model. They're independent, everybody is unique, and there are no clear correlates here.
Which I think is quite an important insight to overcome my own biases. If I now say, look, Lars, I believe if someone is open, then they're also more likely to be cooperative versus competitive. You're telling me, no, that's biased by your own perception, by maybe how my own preferences are, but that's not the case statistically.
Exactly. And again, we are able to then reflect upon that. Like, what kind of experiences might be informing this opinion that you are now bringing to the table? Again, that says something about you more than it says about the Big Five model.
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting learning point here.
Yeah, as we're looking at the last Big Five dimension here, like sensitivity and emotional stability, this is something that makes us a little unique compared to other Big Five inventories, is that we completely said we don't want neuroticism as a term within our Big Five model. Of course, the concept that we have here, like the sensitivity concept, still reverts back to the neuroticism as it is proven to be part of the Big Five model, existing within people, of course. Neuroticism is a valid character trait. Yet, there is a lot of stigmatization that went into the term being neurotic, neuroticism. We try to give you as the coach a tool that is very much free of such associations, right? I have observed that if I, for example, revert back to the term neuroticism, people always they wall up. They say, okay. But as soon as I talk about sensitivity, they are very much interested in talking about their sensitive side, because this is something they don't associate with any negative stigma or anything bad. And this is something that makes us a very good tool to really approach the personality of a person as free of any previous expectations, free of any stigmas that might exist in a person's head, and allow a person to then, of course, open up to the idea that they might be neurotic in certain aspects, or as we call it, they are sensitive, right? They might have tension level plus, they might be socially sensitive, and, for example, impulsive. There's nothing bad about it. There's no good or bad personality, and that's what we try to convey to your coachee, to your employees, that they are good, no matter what kind of personality traits they have. They are good, how they are, who they are, and it's just important to get that picture, to understand who they really are, and not a mirror image that they try to paint by themselves.
So basically doing a bit of a tiny euphemism maybe by neuroticism to sensitivity to aid in that developmental process and get acceptance and the ability to reflect and talk about this on the coachee side. And it's funny that you say that, because I had quite a few people here on the podcast who've been using MBTI. And for me also, MBTI was the first personality types model that I came in touch with. And what I also really liked, and what I heard people say they like about MBTI versus the Big Five, is exactly this neutral scale. Like in MBTI, for example, there is also extraversion, introversion, obviously. Then also a focus on intuition versus sensing. And these terms, they allow to feel at home on either side, while the Big Five model, and especially this neuroticism category, almost sounds a bit like diagnosis of mental illness, or at least of neuroticism. And that's why you changed it. That makes a lot of sense. Cool. To conclude our character section, what I found interesting, and it confirms what you've said earlier about this being a developmental tool, is that in the end of the section, we have a set of 6 reflection questions, Which situations did your preferences become particularly visible in the past? Also, another one here would be which of your personality preferences have contributed especially to your success, and so forth. Like, how do you usually use these?
So, of course, the main focus is to engage with your client, with your coachee, with your employee. And there are, of course, people that are very easily to activate. Like you are, for example, that if I drop a term, like how does your social strategic communication is expressing itself, and you might open up to that really quickly and give me the option as a coach to then understand what you are about. Of course, there are also people that are more closed up. They are less willing to immediately share their inner thoughts and beings. And in order to give them the ability to maybe prepare for a talk, you might say, let's have a look at the reflection questions below. Maybe you prep these questions as well and bring them to our debrief. Or, of course, you can use them very flexibly in the talk themselves and be like, let's look at the reflection questions, making a person as comfortable as possible, being able to then tell you about who they actually are.
Yeah. Awesome. That makes a lot of sense. Just to wrap up this review, we have the motive structure. What would be common themes to look into here?
Yeah, of course, values is something, or purpose-drivenness is something that is of importance to you. Of course, a person can be driven by more than one motive, and each motive can be present in more than one situation. In order to unpack now, where do we want to go? Are you able to use these motives currently, right? In your current situation, what you are doing from the day to day, again, we're referenced back to your work life. Are you able to express your purpose? Are you actually able to strive towards that purpose? Are you able to use these motives currently? Or is this something you may not be able to?
Yeah, I would say very much yes. I mean, being a founder is always about doing many things at the same time, being in a different role one day than the other, learning a lot all the time. So all of that really pays into plenty of these, like the performance, the growth, the creativity. I can really see that in my daily life. I can choose where I believe which kind of work is purposeful to do. So there I also can bring in the values. And I think that's probably then a good choice of profession. And I would say I also had this in my employed jobs, where I was working in business development, partnership development, which was also a lot about creatively coming up with ideas. What new products could the company develop into? With whom could they work? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what we want, right? We want to understand what drives us currently and how does this affect us as a person in the future. And can we then, of course, use this in order to allow us to, well, get that challenge done, be successful in dealing with, for example, becoming a dad.
Yeah. Cool. So this is all themes that we could explore here. Sorry to not giving you much space to actually go into a coach role by coaching myself with this prompt. Makes it really, really a pleasant process.
Awesome.
Yeah, lastly, just to wrap up, here we see the competencies that we explored earlier, the overview, and then I just picked out two of them here. And thirdly, I have reflection questions again, right? What would we do in this section?
Yeah, we of course try to now paint a picture of is your behavior like? What is central to your person? You, for example, mentioned earlier that initiative is something that we should discuss a little bit, right? Because you're taking a lot of initiative all the time. And you have already mentioned that that could be something you could improve upon, right? You're starting a lot of projects, and then you have to deal with that in some way. This section allows us to do exactly that we can, of course, go back, like what strengths are associated with your initiative.
Yeah, there would certainly be quite a few things that we could explore here. And with the reflection questions, that also seems relatively straightforward, even if I'm not super experienced as a coach. Love it. Great. Let's close the chapter of looking at my report at this point and do a exercise that I thought would be fun, because as mentioned, I have many coaches here, and oftentimes I ask them to bring their favorite tool, and then we look into that. Due to that, I recently was able to do a DISC personality assessment, and what we can see here is the result. So DISC also has this motivator section that in some ways is similar to your motives, I guess. And I thought it would be interesting to actually compare a bit the tools and see you react and comment here. So what do you see here in the DISC assessment? How do you believe, are you doing things differently at LINC? And where can we draw parallels and differences?
First of all, it looks pretty. It's a beautiful diagnostic image here. We have a lot of data that is conveyed through a very beautiful range of colors. There are a lot of numbers here that make things to a certain degree academic, numerable. But of course, it's lacking, at least in what I can see here right now, it's lacking depth, right? Because that's the difference at the core of what we do different. We try to give you as much depth as possible, to really try to give the person the ability to go into detail. As a coach, that you are able to really understand every aspect to the situations, to the challenges your coaches are bringing to the table, because that's why they are sitting in front of you, at least of what I'm seeing here. Reducing this to a certain expression, a certain color that is more dominant than another, doesn't really help you as the coach, you as the HR professional, as much as what we are trying to give you, right? To give you the complexity, the opener into talking to your coaches in detail, trying to really get to know them. And I think that's definitely something that we're doing different from what DISC is, at least in what I can see here, what I can read here.
Yeah, I think I would disagree to some extent, because of course, this is also just one overview that I took from a very long report that I received. If we actually zoom out here and look at the reports of DISC and LINC, which are both here on the board, we can see that the DISC report is also huge. In fact, many more pages than the LINC report. I'm not sure if that's necessarily a positive, but I think we cannot say that, okay, it just reduces it to 4 colors, and that's why it's not valid. I think what you refer to is that in popular science, in the workplace, people often use the simplicity of the DISC report to then simplify it even further and say, okay, there's this yellow guy again who tends to talk a lot. But we could also do the same thing with LINC, right? We could also say, this guy who scores high on extroversion, or even simpler, here's the extrovert who tends to talk a lot. And I think that risk is there for any assessment, I guess.
Of course it is. It's something that is just a basic need for us as people. We always try to reduce cognitive complexity. We always make heuristics. We always try to put things into categories. This is just a natural tendency. And in order, of course, to battle that tendency for our coaches that are certified with LINC, we have, as I just mentioned, a certification process, which really goes into detail to, first of all, how to derive the data that we present to you, and then also give you the ability to present it as objectively as possible, with as much depth as possible, and to really get into the aspect of getting to know the person with as little putting a person into a category as possible, and to really listen and understand, who is this person actually? What is this person referring to? What can we do now to really help this person in his or her developmental journey?
Yeah, so what I hear is we as coaches, it helps to focus on the spectrum and really show the client, okay, you have a choice. In a way, you have a developmental choice to follow your preference, to recharge your batteries, but maybe also at some point don't follow your preference, saying stay on the open side if you have this tendency to be more careful, or vice versa. And the same, I'd say, I could also do with the DISC model. Let's say tune down the yellow scale here a bit. And I think what we can see here is that in the end, both tools can be weaponized, I think is what another guest of mine, Marie, said. Any tool can be weaponized if you simplify it too much, if you use it to box people. And maybe due to its simplicity, the risk is simply higher for this to happen with DISC.
Yes. In the end, of course, there's always a big benefit to any instrument you use, right? Every tool has its unique purpose, has its application. And the big challenge for you as a coach, for you as an HR professional, is to really understand, what does this tool bring to the table? What kind of purpose is behind this tool? When is a good situation that I should use tool X and tool Y? And when should I use tool Y over tool X? And having a basic understanding, not just as what is presented here to me, but also how to convey the information. that will make you really able to benefit from, of course, something like a LINC Personality Profiler. So it's just not the data itself, it's just not the way it's conveyed, it's also the context of learning, understanding, being able to really bring the tool into practice, get feedback, and engage, of course, also with the tool developers themselves to really get the point of what is this tool developed for. And that's exactly what we are offering, right? We at LINC are a small company still, and my day-to-day task is really to talk to our coaches, to engage with them, to get their feedback, to, again, teach them, maybe apply the information with your coaches, also on a case-to-case basis, to really benefit your coachee as best as possible and to really drive the coaching process with as much depth as possible as well.
Yeah. So either way, it makes sense to get trained as a coach on the tool that you're using. That's what I hear. So you can also convey it with that nuance that's required.
Yes.
Well, I think many of my guests have said, don't overanalyze your choice of tool. Just do your research, pick one, and then get properly trained on it. Yeah, thanks, Lars. And if I'm now a coach and I say, okay, this actually looked really interesting, what would be my next steps? And maybe also interesting, what are the costs associated to taking these next steps?
Yeah, the obvious next step is to get more information, really get in contact with us. Usually you can reach out to me directly via our webpage. And then, of course, there would be the certification that is next on your agenda. This is done via Zoom, so you don't have to go anywhere. It's very flexible. Certification is once a month, usually on a Thursday and Friday, always from 10 to 5. And you're then, of course, able to use all our tests, which is not just the LINC Personality Profiler, but there are lots of derivatives that we have in our portfolio as well, which allow you to really go in depth with the information. We are very open and say very clearly that we have one upfront cost, which is just a certification for 890 euros. And once you've done that, you have access to all our tools forever and ever. And we also have to say that each LINC Personality Profiler is not a tool that will set you back a lot of money. So one LINC Personality Profiler is usually priced at just under 60 euros for you as a coach to make it really as approachable and as usable as possible.
Okay, so 2-day certification program happening online. That's 890 euros one off. And then each test that I use with a client is just under 60 euros. Great. Thank you so much, Lars, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Tobi.
This is it regarding my LINC profile for today. I definitely appreciate the scientific rigor and really like the adjustments that the LINC team has made to the language of the original Big Five model. My conclusion with regards to our small comparison of DISC versus LINC is that yes, you cannot reduce personality to 4 colors. But unlike the LINC team sometimes claims, DISC also actually doesn't try to do that. Both assessments describe preferences on different scales and provide in-depth reports with nuance and food for reflection. And both assessments are supposed to be debriefed together with a coach. If you're curious to do exactly that kind of work, then you can learn more about LINC and about becoming certified on LINC.de, or if you're based in the US, lincnorthamerica.com. LINC is currently expanding worldwide and will be available in 10 languages by the end of this year. I find it super impressive how they have built a reputation in an already crowded market. And this is why I'm super excited to discuss this entrepreneurial journey with Dr. Ronald Franke, one of the 2 founders of LINC, on our next episodes. Prepare for an unexpected story of building with and for coaches, how the initial product of LINC did not work out, but how it eventually became the profiler that is taken by more than 40,000 people every year today. For all of that, tune in again in 2 weeks on our next Making of a Coach. I'm Tobi from metaFox. If you have any feedback or thoughts on this episode or others, just text me on LinkedIn. And of course, I'm super grateful if you leave a rating and subscribe. All the best on your journey. Bye-bye.